Solvik, Vice President of Mahler Foundation, and host, writer, and producer of the Mahler Hour, where we bring you the personalities, places, and projects happening right now in the Mahler community around the world. Last month, we celebrated the birthday of Ludwig van Beethoven with a show dedicated to Mahler's relationship to this towering figure of musical history. I was joined by Beethoven scholar John Wilson as we explored the veneration around Beethoven around 1900, Mahler's personal worship of the composer, as well as his orchestral retouchings of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. We also listened to echoes of Beethoven in Mahler's first three symphonies as examples of compositional influence. Remember, you can see this show and all past Mahler Hours on our website and on our YouTube channel. For this episode of the Mahler Hour, we are going to start a new series called Family Portraits, where we explore members of the wider Mahler family who have a special connection, often a musical connection, to the great composer. Today, we will uncover the life and work of a forgotten member of Mahler's family, Robert Mahler. This composer and conductor, who lived in Vienna and worked with the likes of Victor Leon in the early 1900s, emigrated to Chile and became a leading figure in musical life there. It is a fascinating story that we are eager to tell you. Before we begin, let me remind everyone attending live to post any questions you might have to the comments section. We will get to these at the end of our show. Don't forget to include your name and the country you are writing from. Also, the Mahler Hour is brought to you by Mahler Foundation. So if you want to support our activities, please become a member. Just go to our website at mahlerfoundation.org for all of the details. Now, on to our topic, Robert Mahler, or Roberto Mahler, as he is known here in Chile. We are fortunate to have with us today a specialist on this individual. Joining me here in Santiago is Jose Manuel Izquierdo. Welcome to the Mahler Hour.
Hello, Morten. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a fascinating story. We're going to try to get to as much of it as we can this hour and also play some musical examples. But first, tell us how you stumbled upon this. I would like to call him a forgotten Mahler until perhaps today.
Well, I was born in Valdivia, in the city in the south of Chile, where Roberto Mahler lived for 30 years and died. So when I studied music, a lot of the old music teachers say, well, you know, there was this Mahler we had in the city who was our teacher, who died years ago, and he was always mentioned like he was related to Gustav Mahler, but no one believed him. And so it was this like strange story that came up like every time I spoke with any of the old musicians in the city years ago.
And you went on to become a musicologist, so it kind of made sense that you would want to figure this out.
Yeah. Then when I studied my BA in musicology, so like 20 years ago, I thought, well, maybe this could be a good topic for like a first dissertation, and try to go like, who was this man, this Roberto Mahler, who did so much actually for the music in the south of Chile?
Well, let's begin with the relationship, because if people didn't believe him, I think we've been able to dig out enough genealogical evidence. I think we have a chart showing exactly how Gustav and Robert were related. I think it's easier perhaps to talk about that. They were first cousins, weren't they?
Yeah, well, people in Valdivia always say, well, maybe they were cousins, nephews, and thank you, well, to you and the Mahler Foundation. Now we know more than they were actually cousins. And their fathers, the fathers of Gustav and Robert, you know, Bernard and Philip were brothers. And Gustav, of course, was born in 1860, while Robert was born a bit later in 1881, but very nearby, only a few kilometers from each other. But as you mentioned before, these were very large families, you know, but I think maybe at some point they might have met actually.
Well, as you say, Robert spent most of his early life just 30 kilometers north of Chile, which is also about 30 kilometers from Caliste, where Mahler was born. So the whole clan really stayed within a close proximity of one another, and it seems unlikely they would have lost touch, especially since Bernhard and Philip were brothers, and there were more brothers living in, I'm hoping I pronounce this properly, Havliškov Brod, as the name of the town is. And as you can see from the chart here, they were large families. I didn't include all of the members of the family, but you can see Bernhard, of course, had 14 children. Philip had 11. And there were perhaps some opportunities for at least some of them to get together. What do we know about Robert's early life, Jose?
Well, we don't know much about his very early years, still in Moravianlands, but then he moved to Vienna at some point around 1899 or 1900. So the first few years of his life as a musician, professional musician, were in Vienna. He published a lot with one company, Bosworth and Company from London. They had a branch in Vienna. And he started publishing with them around 1901 until 1912, more or less. So he was trying to publish a lot of lieder, piano music, piano and violin, choir. So he was working as a composer. It was a bit difficult because at least once, maybe twice, when he promoted his concerts as, Mahler concert, it became confusing for people in Vienna. That this was this other Mahler doing music, and that became of something even in the newspapers. But yeah, he was doing that in Vienna in the first decade of the 20th century.
In fact, he was promoted by Bosworth. Let's have a look at a page dedicated to his compositions up until then. This must have been around 1908. And we'll see here Bosworth listing Robert Mahler's compositions in a rather grand fashion. And if we zoom in a little bit, we'll see his Opus 7 here, his Albumblatt. While we don't have a recording of it in its original form, we do have a recording. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're going to listen to now?
Well, we have in Valdivia, in this city in the south, we have done a few pieces by Robert Mahler over the last 10, 15 years. But last year, because it was the 70th anniversary of his passing, we did a large concert, like a 1-hour concert of his music called The Other Mahler, El Otro Mahler. So we did a few arrangements, a few sort of reimaginings of his music too, and a few completely like straight pieces, like the way he would have played them with his orchestra in Valdivia, 90 years, 100 years ago.
So this is an early composition by Robert Mahler from his early days as a composer in Vienna, in an arrangement. And we'll see the details of the performance as we listen to this. So that was Albumblatt, Opus 7, number 1 by Robert Mahler in an arrangement by René Silva and the Chamber Orchestra of Valdivia. conducted by Roberto Fischer. This was a piece originally for violin and piano, and is this typical for his style at this time?
It is, and there are three things I would like to mention. I didn't mention one. He was a violinist, so that sort of explains a lot of his early music. The second thing is that we use Roberto Mahler's original metronome during the concert. That's the reason you heard the metronome at the beginning. And the theory is a live recording. But yeah, he was I think he was trying to do both things, like being sort of a more traditional classical composer, writing a sonata or two, and then also with a lot of lieder published at this time, but also this sort of almost salon music going into more of a popular style. I think he's trying both.
Right, and as we know from his subsequent career, it became more and more popular, didn't it? And what the style he was writing in and his focus.
Yeah, well, he became a conductor of Operetta around the last years of that decade, so 1909, 1910, before the war. And he traveled a little with a company, an operetta company. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah.
And of course, later he wrote a few stage works. One of maybe the largest one was Wiener Volkssänger, which
Right.
in 1920 with Victor Leon for the lyrics and the libretto, which was quite popular with the audiences, it seems, and also played in the radio during the 20s and published as scores, but the critics didn't like it very much, but you know, it often happens.
We have an announcement here of a performance at the Raimund Theater in May 1920 of Wiener Volkssänger. And it's described as a folk piece with song and dance in 4 acts by Victor Leon, music by Robert Mahler. If we can go a little bit in on that, I think we have a larger view of it. You'll also see that we have the Robert Mahler is the conductor of that performance. And as you indicate, Victor Leon was no slouch. I mean, he had already produced and written for the likes of Richard Heuberger, the Opernball, Wiener Blut, Johann Strauss, and of course, The Merry Widow by Franz Lehár that came out in 1905. So he was a major enough figure that Robert Mahler himself must have been respected in the field of operetta.
I think he must have been, yeah. He was, at this time, he was already at least conducting operetta for at least 10, 12 years with, travel and so on. And of course, Victor Leon is, there is the Merry Widow. So working with Victor Leon was a major thing. People were expecting, what will he do next? Will there be another Merry Widow? And they kept being good friends, and actually they wrote a few songs together. One of them became very popular later on, Einmal ist keinmal. But yeah, I think they were close friends.
We don't have a recording of Wiener Volkssänger as far as I know. I mean, there's some irony here, of course, that folk song is an element that fascinated his cousin Gustav. And Gustav, of course, took a very different approach to what folk song means, certainly not in the operatic sense, but taking his poetry from Das Klammern Wunderhorn and making it more of an art song. And in this sense, it really became more of an operetta, popular, light approach to music, if I can use that term. I don't want to denigrate what we're about to hear. But he did use some of these melodies in a piece that he later put together called, appropriately enough, Old Vienna, Vienna Antigua. And we can hear some of the melodies in this performance that we're about to hear. Yep,
it's a performance by students in Valdivia, so different quality, and also live performance. But yeah, I think it's also nice that he titles it Vienna Antigua, writing this in the 1940s in Chile, because it's at the same time about this old Vienna from Wiener Volkssänger, but also maybe his own nostalgia about the Vienna he left.
Right. There is something extremely nostalgic and extremely Viennese, of course. And it's not just the waltz, it's somehow the way that this is somehow colored by memory and sentimentality. And it's something, of course, one often associates with Vienna.
Yeah, fully agree with that.
So it seems the trajectory of someone born only 20 years after Mahler, who was already entering the more popular vein. What we often forget, I think, in music history, certainly if we focus on Gustav Mahler, is that this becomes the age of radio and popular music and musical styles largely influenced by the United States, jazz and other popular forms that really take the European continent by storm. And Robert Mahler is no exception. He too is keeping up with the times, so to speak, and became a figure who was popular enough to be featured on the Radio Wien programs in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because it has, this first decade of being a composer, second decade of being an operetta, and the 20s is really about being in the radio and being just like jazz composer and popular music composer. So he writes a lot of new songs. He sort of remakes some of the melodies he did before, like this album Blood for the radio. And you can see I've been through the sort of Radio Bean magazine programs through the years, and you can see a lot of music by Roberto Mahler being performed. And I think it's interesting. It was not only performed in the 20s while he was in Vienna, but it kept being performed in the 30s when he was already in Chile. 10, 12 years after he left, he was still being played. Some of the songs became actually quite popular. So Einmal ist keinmal, with lyrics by Victor Leon, which I think translates as "one time doesn't count."
That's
But
right.
it's translated in Chile as something completely different, like "one kiss is not enough." Un besito es mucho.
That's right.
So it's more straightforward. And then Tugen ist ungesund, Kalamaika. There were a few songs that kept being played even into the 30s, I think.
So this is an announcement from the 14th of July, 1928. And if we zoom in on the right-hand corner here, the lower right-hand corner, we'll see something called a Tanzkonzert. And this Tanzkonzert gives us a sense of what this kind of music meant at the time, because we have to use the word jazz lightly, don't we? I mean, this is clearly not, this isn't the stuff that is being produced so much in the United States. Well, perhaps to some extent, but there were foxtrots, one-steps, and other popular styles. And if we can get that graphic, we'll see it's Arthur Lange, Raymond Matthews, Robert Stolz, for instance, and as you mentioned, work by Robert Mahler, Einmal ist keinmal, which was certainly one of his hits. Here it's listed as a blues number, which I find really fascinating.
I think people use these sort of American words to mean, we are being modern and this popular and so on. And I think Robert Mahler was also very much connected to a lot of the really popular musicians of the time. Like, for example, we have music by Friedrich Hollander in his, papers, and people popular from Vienna. So yeah, it's that sort of style.
You've dug out a wonderful recording of the signation for this show, and I just wanted to play a little bit of this for our audiences. This is Hallo, Hallo here, Radio Wien. Let's just listen to what would have been at the beginning of this broadcast.
Hallo, hallo, hier Radio Wien, ein jeder schmunzelt vor sich hin. Ertönt der wohlbekannte Ruf, der vielen schon Vergnügen schuf. Die Mutter schreit, es geht schon los, und Kinder schwimmt, die Freude ist groß. Die Mist, die bringt sich unter Brand, die alle sind schon arrogant. Wenn nur erklingt der erste Ton, versöhnlich wird der Schwiegersohn. Josef die heute käppelt dann, ist einmal Schiff und Horsch gespannt. Auf Welle 503.
It's just a fantastic explanation. It goes on for almost 3 minutes, and it talks about everybody grouping around the radio. Even the old aunt is going to be there, and she's going to be in a good mood, and how the whole family is somehow brought to life and harmony with all of this wonderful music that you're about to hear in the radio. It's just a fascinating glimpse into that time.
It is amazing. Well, people were still a bit scared of the radio, and they had a lot of moral thinking about the ethics of listening to radio together. But then it's about that, and I think and they have a good actor to sing it. And of course, after that would come the songs and the dances and the light music, orchestral music, and that's where Robert Mahler fits.
Right. And one of his big hits, which was played for many years thereafter, up until 1937, as you've found out, is Calamaica. And do you want to say anything about this? We're about to hear, this is a much shorter piece, but it seemed to be very, very popular.
It was very popular, yes, as you mentioned, until the late 30s, just before the Anschluss, really. And then it was also performed in Chile, and it became a sort of a choir staple in a choir version in the south of Chile for years. I listened to it when I was little by the local choir. So it begins with the sort of the bells of a town, and then a few melodies. People have mentioned me. One person told me like they felt like very old sort of Moravian southern church melodies, maybe sort of reinvented. But it's a short piece. Probably it was repeated at the time, and this is Roberto Mahler's original orchestration.
This is his orchestration, the original orchestration.
Yeah.
Ah, wonderful. Well, it does. It's very catchy, isn't it? I think of that. I mean, it's clearly influenced, I would think, by the Eastern Europe, or even maybe in sort of Viennese concept of the Oriental. There's a very interesting history of that with Mozart and Beethoven and others sort of inventing Anachar music, and there's a little bit of that in the first theme area. But more close to home, of course, Robert was from a Czech-speaking area, and I think he also set some songs in Czech, didn't he?
He did during the first decade of his professional life. Yeah.
It's fun that became a hit. Just a reminder, if you are with us live, feel free to send us questions to the chat. We'll be happy to answer in the Q&A at the end of the hour, as we continue with our discussion about Robert Mahler. All right. Let's turn now to how Robert becomes Roberto, how he heads to Chile, because it seems this wasn't just a one-time decision to go, that he had some experience in South America before he decided to stay there.
Yeah, well, it's so Maria Fialik, a musicologist in Vienna, she has done some research on that, and how I think he was in charge of this operetta troupe in Vienna, and it became a touring troupe just before the first war. So yeah, we see him in a few travels around Europe, and then in 1913 going to America for the first time, apparently the first time. So being in Rio de Janeiro and in Buenos Aires. I think it was mainly in Buenos Aires that the company was. So it's very interesting because he was connected to that and performing, well, Merry Widow and Mikado, and also, different kinds of operetta. One of the troupe members also is interesting, is a singer, Paula Heine, mentioned living in Vienna, and And that might be interesting because we know he married to a Paula, later mentions Paula Mahler, so we don't know her maiden surname, but it might have been the same Paula because she's mentioned as a singer, and she arrived in Chile later as a singer with him.
So the manifest, you've managed to dig up the manifest. Let's have a look at that because it's fascinating to see among the many, many people on the boat, those associated with Robert Mahler. It's hard to read from here, but there are dancers and there are singers and there are actors. This is clear the whole troupe. And if we can focus on a little bit there, you'll see this is a boat leaving in 1913 with destinations of Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires. And you'll see there in between the two lines, Robert Mahler. He's listed as single, living in Prague, and that he's 31. We have some pretty good evidence that he was 28 at the time. I don't know where that came from. And if one looked further down the list, we find this Paula Heine, who was a member of the troupe, as you mentioned. So this was 1913. And as you say, this was one of several trips by the Operetta company.
It is, but this might have been the last one. The war came the year after, and then we see him as in the military for a few years, probably as a band leader, as many musicians were. And so that, of course, that stopped the career and the sort of traveling operetta company thing. So we find him in Chile for the first time really in 1925, performing again with this traveling operetta company. But then this is the interesting part. He comes back to this city, Valdivia, for a longer time, for a few months, and then it's very interesting because he just comes with Paula, and they perform more like Lida, even really interesting, like a very interesting repertoire, like a mixture of 19th century, but also very modern Lida for the public. They stay for 2 years, really, and then Robert goes back to Europe. Stays for a few months. He is in Berlin, he is in Vienna, and then gets an official permit. That's very interesting. This is for the Chilean consulate in Vienna. Now as Roberto, and asking for all the details to actually officially migrate to Chile.
Right. Let's have a look at that document. It's fascinating to see. This is a police document that he had to submit to the Chilean consulate in Vienna to prove that he had no police record. It's stamped by the police department. And if we move in a little bit closer to that, you'll see some very valuable information. And since it's an official document, we're going to take them at their word with regard to his date of birth, his place of birth, and a not insignificant change to his name, Roberto Mahler. That maybe have been someone, the secretary at the Chilean consulate, just making the assumption that that was his true name. But we do know that later he was using that name, and it stuck with him for the rest of his life, didn't it?
Yeah, that was now his Chilean name, Roberto Mahler. And this is the moment we can see that change from, one part of his life to a new part of his life.
Yeah. And we don't know. I mean, he must have enjoyed some success, popularity, and I guess peace of mind in Chile in the 1920s, as you say, 25, 26, coming back, deciding, maybe wondering, am I going to stay in Vienna? Am I going to go back to Chile? Then deciding to return, which he seems to have done here in 1928. His wife, in all likelihood, returned with him as well. And there's an interesting and unfortunate, sad, really, continuation of their story.
Yeah, their story is a bit of a mystery yet, but there are some clues to it. And what different people told me that actually knew them from close is that she was not Jewish and he was. So in the 1930s, we can talk more about Valdivia and the specificity of Valdivia later on, but I think it was a complicated relationship at the moment. She returned to Austria in 1937, and she never came back to Chile. So they got split. And what exactly happened and how that happened and what happened to their relationship is not that clear, but it might have been related to the political and sort of social aspects of the 1930s too.
Yeah, it was a long trip. When you went across, you were likely to stay for longer, and not even a year later, we have the terrible events of the Anschluss and other things happening in that setting. We have a letter, and one of the clues to all of this is a letter that Robert Mahler wrote to his friend Victor Leon. And in this letter, he talks openly about his difficulties, but he also says in a quite moderate and in fact somewhat sentimental but friendly tone that his wife is going to drop by and give him his greetings. So there doesn't seem to be any animosity or even any hint of something of a break happening anytime soon.
Yeah, not at all. And this is a wonderful letter, really. It's in the
Yeah.
Nachlass of Victor Leon in the library in Vienna, in the National. And of course, he uses a few Spanish words in between, like se cambia la cosa, like waiting for things to change, and
Right.
saying that he had lost so much money and thinking maybe not staying more in Valdivia, but moving to Santiago, to the capital, maybe get a post there as a teacher in the National Conservatory. But nothing of this, happened. But he seems to be friendly with his wife when she left for Vienna yet. So it seems like a complicated, maybe a bit tragic story mixed with the war and the Anschluss and everything in between. And of course,
Yes.
to Victor Leon, who died, shortly
Awful.
afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, awful. He died during the war, trying to hide from the Nazis in Vienna. So let's talk a little bit about the political developments, because as you've already intimated, it's a very complex situation. Robert Mahler had the good fortune to unwittingly have moved to South America before Nazism, fascism, etc., overtook Austria and Vienna. But he didn't quite escape from those political influences, did he?
No, it was difficult to escape. Well, that's the thing. He moved to Valdivia. Valdivia is a really small city at the time. It's 30,000 people. But it's a very specific and special city in the context of Chile and South America in many ways, because it is a very old colonial city, so 16th century city with a lot of that Spanish background and old Spanish families. That was like 3,000 people in the mid-19th century, and then it became the hub for the big German immigration that was official by the Chilean government in the mid-19th century. So in the next decades, 10,000 Germans came to the city. It completely reshaped, so the south of Chile, of course, the Lake District, but also the city itself. So Roberto Mahler, I think the reason he settled in Valdivia in the mid-1920s is he realized there was this big German, Austrian, German-speaking community, really, where he could establish himself as a violinist, as a teacher. He very quickly became the conductor of all the choirs, all the bands. So it was a really good place. At the same time, because it was such a German city, it became the center for the Nazi movement in Chile in the 1930s. So you see then everything changing quickly. Like he arrives in 1928, just before the economic crisis. 4 years later, a lot of people changed. Like they get a new pastor for the Lutheran Church, which is from the Nazi Party, and then the director of the German school is from the Nazi Party, and Roberto Mahler is fired from the school and his job, and from a lot of the choirs and bands. So you can also see in this letter for Victor Leon that he was realizing that he had to move from Valdivia. So yeah, he escaped from the Nazis in the war sense, but he couldn't fully escape all of that.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine this transformation of the place that he had arrived in, because as you say, already in the 19th century, German culture had become so prevalent there that he must have felt in some ways very much at home. In this transformation, though, there seems to have been a response also on the part of Chile to the rise of Nazism, so that when we get a little bit into the 1930s, it becomes even more complex, doesn't it?
Yeah, because you couldn't publicly sort of say that you were in favor of another nation or part of another nation. So for all the German communities, that was very difficult. You couldn't have like the German club had to change the name to something different, like the Union Club, and the German bands say, no, we're just a regular Chilean band, just speak German. So there is part of that as a law, but also I think there was a lot, like anti-Semitism too in Santiago and other parts of Chile at the time. Thankfully, now in the last few years, the National Archives are opening all the sort of official investigation documents from the times, from the 30s and 40s, and you can see a lot of the leaflets being given in Santiago in the streets, like don't hire Jewish people in your companies and so on. So I think that might have been part of why, even if he was really qualified and could have gone to the National Conservatory, the National Conservatory wasn't really hiring immigrants at the time, or foreign people. It was very much against that and actually firing a lot of them. So it was a difficult time also in Chile, where Nazism was quite big actually during the 30s.
You also mentioned something else that comes up in the letter to Leon, and that is he basically lost his savings because of the financial crisis and the crash that everyone went through at that time. The Chileans weren't spared of that either.
No, they weren't, and also, Chile was really based. The economy was based on saltpeter, like salitre. So that was very big part of the economy. And then at that time, Germany invented artificial saltpeter, and the economy collapsed during the 30s, really. But at the same time, he couldn't go back to Europe. So it must have been really difficult for him to do really tough decisions in the 30s.
Yeah. And in the late 30s, he seems to also have, as you mentioned, have been abandoned by his wife. And so it must have been very, very difficult also to, as you say, make a living. But he did persist. But before we get into sort of the post-war era, I want to talk a little bit about his assisting people to escape Austria, because there's a very touching aspect of this. It has to do with a writer in Chile who happened to be a writer whose parents were affected by this and who was able to write a novel around it. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, he's Raúl Sor. Raúl Sor is a really well-known writer and journalist in Chile, sort of the main international journalist in Chile. And Raúl published, which for me was really surprising, this novel, La Guerra de Mahler, The War of Mahler, a few years ago. And everyone called me saying, why is someone writing about Roberto Mahler? You say no one know him. So I called Raúl. He was really friendly. We have spoken many times. Maybe he's listening to this. And Raúl said, well, I wanted to write a novel about him because I'm really, really grateful for him, because he saved my parents. My parents couldn't escape after the Anschluss from Vienna, and they were like really distant family, apparently, or something, or they knew each other from before. And Roberto Mahler sent a lot of papers saying, I can hire them, I can get them a job in Valdivia. So they came to Valdivia. So now I know at least 3 families that arrive to Valdivia because Roberto Mahler sent the papers and helped them escape from Vienna. So the novel is quite a lot of fun. It's based on reality, and Roberto Mahler is a real person, but also it's mixed with sort of a lot of detective work and U-boats and submarines going around Valdivia and the South Pacific, which actually happened, and sort of Nazi spies and all of that. So it's actually quite a fun novel.
So it's a historical novel that takes our hero Roberto to places that and functions that he never had. But the idea of him being someone who literally rescued people from the Nazi terror in Austria, I think, is a fascinating chapter of this man's life. As you say, you already know of 3 families. It's hard to go back and document all of this. I'm sure there were, well, it seems there could well have been more people that he saved.
Yeah, it could have been, but in any case, it shows that he cared. He stayed connected with the politics and really tried to. He knew what was happening and he was concerned about this from far away.
It's because of this novel that I stumbled upon Robert Mahler myself and reached out to you eventually. I was told about the novel and that this was Mahler's nephew. And of course, he's not Mahler's nephew. And I was very dismissive of the fact that it was a novel. But there seemed to be much more truth behind this. And the more I looked, the more I was able to find, especially when I was able, thankfully, to get in touch with you.
The thing is, even beyond the fiction of the novel, I think his life is really also a bit of a novel, with all these changes, and so you don't need the fiction part. Yeah.
That's true. That's a good point. There's something quite fantastical about this life, and even in his hardship, he realized he could do something to help others, which I think is very, very moving. Let's turn to his post-war legacy, because he did live past the war, thankfully, and he then became more established in Valdivia, didn't he?
Yeah, he did well. He realized he had to stay in Valdivia, so there are these bad years in between. But actually, he was very much involved with all the musical life in the city, from conducting the sort of regimental band of the city to the choirs and the schools. He was very much involved in all the schools and primary schools and writing music for the children and the anthems and for the different places and the sports, the big sports team of Valdivia. He wrote the anthem for them, El Excelsior, so the basketball team. And he established an orchestra early on. So we can see sort of the beginnings of the orchestra in 26 and then more formally in 29. And it was very much established during the 30s. The big theater in Valdivia was built in 35, 36. So it became sort of the established orchestra of there. It was called Orquesta Mahler. Everyone knew him. And it was very interesting too, because it was the first sort of permanent orchestra in the south of Chile and the Patagonia region. And also it was a very interesting orchestra because it connected people from both sort of the Spanish Chilean side and the German speaking side, which didn't happen at the time. You had sort of German choirs and Spanish choirs, and then the same with the bands and everything. It was the first one to really sort of bridge those two worlds at a time where people were also doing that, marrying each other and so on. So it really says a lot about the time. And of course, it's also fun because they did these concerts in the theater, but then 2-3 hours later, they perform in the bar of one of the hotels some of the days, some of the popular music. So they have these two sides of him together in the orchestra.
We have a photo of the orchestra, and it really looks more like a large ensemble than an orchestra per se. But of course, as you also mentioned, popular music and locations didn't afford the kind of room that we would associate with a large orchestra. But he's sitting there in the middle. I think we have a pianist to his left or right.
Yep.
And
yeah.
So do you want to say anything about these people here? Because this is, and maybe about roughly the year, do we know when this was taken?
This must have been during the 40s, probably late 40s. So you can see one little boy in between, like 12-year-old boy. He is Leonardo Mancini. He died very recently, and I interviewed him a lot. He was a student of Roberto Mahler, and he's the only one of these people I actually met and interviewed. And he said, he had always had to help and Roberto and go around and sometimes play a little when one of the violinists went, sick or something. But so many of these people were the musicians of the time in the south of Chile, the very first ones to do a lot of the groundwork for which we now have the musical life we have.
And did he go on to become a musician as well?
Leonardo Mancini?
Yeah.
Yes, and he conducted 3 of the choirs in the city, really good violinist, and also music critic, researcher, writing. And his granddaughter, Luciana Mancini, she's a very well-known singer, with a very interesting career in Europe, and so especially in early music. So Luciana Mancini is the granddaughter of Leonardo Mancini, who actually did music because of Roberto Mahler. The reason he went into music was because his father, the first Mancini in the city, lived right next door to Roberto Mahler. And Roberto Mahler said, well, why don't you study a bit of music with me, for free? That's the reason the entire family became musical.
Fascinating. And while we're talking about musical organizations and legacy, because we're already on that topic, you told me an interesting story about the founding of the university.
Yes, well, Valdivia has one of the major universities in Chile, the Universidad Austral, was founded in the 1950s. And And at the time, there was no university in the sort of south of Chile, southern Argentina area. So there was this big project to have one. But the beginnings, the early beginnings became as a sort of a society for organizing concerts. That's the reason the university really kickstarted. And Roberto Mahler was part of that. And in the first meetings, are we going to really go into this having a university, which was a very big, expensive, and politically difficult project? They actually mentioned talking with Roberto Mahler a lot about having a conservatoire and him being in charge of the orchestra of the university and the choir and stuff being part of it. But he was already, I think, quite old and a bit retired. But like one of his students became in charge of all of that. And when the university opened in 1955, it opened already with a faculty of music, a conservatory of music, as one of the three first things they did. So his influence, it was also very much in there.
It's a fascinating, touching story. I'm so focused on legacy. We've skipped over something very important. I just wanted to have our audience hear a little bit of something he wrote when he was in Valdivia. As you indicated, it was so much music at the time, but we do in fact have a work called Primavera that we'd like to present to you here at the close of the show. And here we again hear his metronome, which you had on stage when you did this performance last fall. And again, that was Rodolfo Fischer with the Chamber Orchestra of Valdivia. Basically, I'm assuming a kind of orchestra that you can say was a successor to the music and the performance ensembles that Roberto Mahler put together in that city. Hard not to hear Vienna persisting somehow there, but maybe that was the nature of light music at the time.
Yeah, no, but I think it has something very specifically Viennese too, with a lot of the music he does. And even when they are not called waltzes, there is a bit of that in between and the sort of the rhythm of the different parts and so on, yeah.
And finally, we're reaching the end of our hour, but because of technical difficulties, we started late. So we might well go over the hour. I wanted just to show the tombstone that you organized after this concert in honor of Roberto Mahler and his accomplishment. Let's just see that, because it's sort of a concrete manifestation of this man and this place and his contribution to music, especially in Valdivia. I thought that was a beautiful gesture.
Well, we did it after the concerts last October, and we were with Rodolfo and René, the composer and arranger, and it was really from one day to the other that we say, his thumb it looks so bad, and it's the same one. No one has cared for that in 70 years. We should do something. So we went the morning after and paid for it and rearranged it. So yeah, I think it was a very emotional concert and week in many ways for a lot of people in Valdivia, not only the performers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think entirely appropriate and something easily forgotten, as I mentioned at the top of the show. I think I'd rather turn this over to any audience questions that we might have, just in the minutes that we have left here. Evelyn Nichols asks about what repertoire do they perform. I'm assuming by the question is more directed at his work in South America, in Valdivia. What repertoire did they play? It wasn't just Robert Mahler, obviously.
No, not only. No, they did some chamber music. Even sometimes they expanded this small orchestra a little for more than an ensemble, and they did like smaller symphonies, like Schubert symphonies and so on, or Mendelssohn, like a lot of string music. And there was a bit of Roberto Mahler, but I think in the programs there was never more than one or two pieces by Roberto Mahler. So it's not like this showcase of Roberto Mahler continuously during 20 years. No, it's really, sometimes there isn't even one by him.
Do you have the programs? I mean, is that well documented?
Well, I've been through the newspapers a lot, but sadly, Chile doesn't have a digital newspaper collection. So you have to go through them in paper, and a lot of them have been cut. People have cut bits of the newspaper. So yeah, not perfectly documented, but there are lots of programs.
Here's another question from Anthony Rauman. How did he view himself in his later life, as a Chilean or an Austrian with a Jewish background who was still rooted in his Viennese past? I guess you could choose something or all of the above. How do you speculate that might have been the case?
It's a very good question, because from his late years, I don't have any documents like written by him. So it's more about what people remember, like his students, people that met him, that play in the orchestra. And they all said he was a really sort of sad, nostalgic old man, like complaining about life. Like he used to say that, a few people have told me that he used to say, like, la vida es una porquería, like life is, I don't know, I don't want to say it, but like really bad. So I think he was really, yeah, I think this sort of moment in the late 30s when his wife leaves and he has to stay in Valdivia, he wants to go to Santiago, it doesn't work. Like, it seems like at the beginning, his decision to stay in Valdivia was really his decision, and he wanted to. And by the end of his life, he might have felt like a bit, I'm stuck here, like I just got stuck here, and the war went by, and I'm an old man, and I just stayed here. And quite poor because he lost a lot of his money. So he had a community, the musicians and all of that, and he probably was a bit cross with the German community that fired him and all. So it was not a happy, I think, end for his life. So he might have felt like a nostalgic Viennese person living in Chile, a bit trapped in Chile, maybe.
Yeah, it seems very likely. I'm reminded a little bit of what Mahler Gustav said about his own homelessness and his feeling that he was from very many different cultures and nowhere really entirely at home. Certainly that was certainly the case for Roberto Mahler as well. Maybe not an uncommon fate, especially as the people fled, escaped, those who were able to, this horrible calamity of the 20th century. So I have a question from Julian. Do we know where he is buried? Yes, of course. This is the tombstone. Please, you can tell us where I didn't
Well,
didn't
maybe
say
I can
where it is.
I can tell an anecdote of that because when I was, I don't know, 18, 19, and I started doing this research 20 years ago, I went to the German, cemetery in Valdivia, and I tried to look for it, and they look at the papers, and everyone was, "Oh, we cannot find him. Like, I'm sorry." And then they say, "Well, wait, he's Mahler, so he's Jewish. He couldn't be in this cemetery. Sorry, he has to be in the general one for Valdivia, not in the German one," which was
Right.
quite striking, and for me it was a sort of first realization on about where he was situated in this society. So I went to the Chilean one, and he was really at the very end of it, in a sort of a specific section of it. But we found him, so he's in the general cemetery of Valdivia.
So you mean to say that in 53 they were still distinguishing between Germans and Jews?
Yep. Yeah. And even the person in charge of it, he was very clear, like, "Oh no, if he was Jewish, he is not here. Sorry."
Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are over the hour. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. I will go on to make an announcement. We have just posted an article on Roberto Mahler on our website, written by today's guest, Jose Manuel Izquierdo. So you can go to www.mahlerfoundation.org to learn more about this man and his life, along with some photos and documents. Remember, our website provides the largest collection of Mahler-related information anywhere online. Here you will find his biography, information about his works, and the backgrounds of the many people associated with his life and legacy. And now you can read more about this somewhat less forgotten cousin, Roberto. The Mahler Hour is brought to you by Mahler Foundation and contributors around the world, and is a monthly streaming event bringing together individuals interested in the composer, the thinker, the humanist Gustav Mahler, as we explore not only his life and works, but also how his legacy still informs the essential aspects of the human experience, and how we can turn that experience into a force for the good in today's world. Become a member and support our activities. I want to thank my guest today, Jose Manuel Izquierdo, for joining us, as well as our production team, Marco Ayala, Monica Anguiano for our Executive Director for Administration, and Bert van der Vaal van Dijk in posting the web article and updating the genealogy. The Mahler Hour is back next month. I hope you can join us. That's our program for today. Stay safe. Thanks for watching.